Well, good evening and welcome to Prospect. And tonight we have a special occasion, which is that in addition to visiting us as a magazine, you're also for the first time visiting us as a book publisher. Tonight sees the launch of Prospect Editions, in addition to the long-form narrative journalism that over 30 years Prospect has become known for. We are now moving into a series of deeper dives in subjects that we feel need a longer conversation. And the first such book is being launched tonight. It's being launched around the subject of the Australian model and what it can teach the rest of the world. We have the author with us, Andrew Lowe, for tonight's podcast and video. And I'll be interviewing Andrew during this evening, and also you will have opportunities to ask questions. Before I hand over to Andrew, let me tell you why we chose Australia as the subject for this first book. I first visited Australia as part of my business activities in 2018 and immediately became aware that there was a story I'd been missing, that a country, the other side of the world, had developed an economy that had a GDP per head 30% higher than my own country, had a level of inequality that was much preferable to the United Kingdom, and none of these facts seemed to be known here in the UK. And so I began to dig around and look for somebody who could explain this to me. And 2 years ago, exactly this month, met Andrew, who told me he was writing a book on that very subject. And so we chose this question of the Australian model to be the first of Prospect Editions. Andrew, welcome to Prospect.
Hey, thanks, Clive.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and what led you to write the book?
Yeah. So I had my formative years in Australia, as this suggests, but I've spent about half of my adult life outside of Australia, living in Hong Kong and living in London. And it always struck me that although there's a general affection for Australia, there's not necessarily a great understanding of the country in terms of institutions, the way the healthcare system works, the way the education system works, and to some extent, the assumption, if anything, is it's just like the UK, but in actual fact, in a lot of ways, it's actually quite different.
You've chosen the title of your book, We Should Be So Lucky, and I know that refers back to an important seminal work of Australian sociology in the past. Explain that to us.
Yeah. So almost exactly 60 years ago, 1964, a guy called Donald Horne wrote a book called The Lucky Country, which was probably the first attempt and certainly the most resonant attempt to explain Australian exceptionalism or what's different about Australia. I take some things from that I think are still very valid, but also a lot's happened in 60 years, and I think there were some things in retrospect that Horne probably got wrong.
Well, I'm hoping that tonight you can help break down for us how much of Australia's success is due to luck. It is a continent right on the edge of what's become an important part of the world in Asia. It's blessed with natural resources, and all of us have seen on TV and on film, of course, the pictures of the wonders of the place and its beauty, versus, of course, how much work Australians have had to do themselves to build such a successful and functioning economy and also institutional framework.
Yep.
In reading your book, it was particularly that question of how your institutions have developed that really struck me. Could you explain what you think is so different and exceptional about the Australian institutions?
Yeah. So there clearly was the good fortune that Australia came together as a country in 1901, which was very much the peak of that British liberalism, the institutions, the Enlightenment, and so on. And all of those things, together with some of the learnings from the American and French revolutions and so on, went into the Constitution. So you've got parliamentary democracy, rule of law, but with an elected upper house and states. But then Australia then tweaked and improved that, particularly during the beginning of the 20th century. So the female franchise started in Australia. The secret ballot, which was known for some time as the Australian ballot, was developed in Australia, then obviously came across the world. But then some things that Australia improved on haven't been taken up. One of them is compulsory voting. So in Australia, everyone votes. You can turn. You don't have to choose a particular candidate, but you do have to turn up to the booth. And as it turns out, most people, once they get there, do feel that they have a preference of one or the other. voting is also preference share voting. So the you rank the candidates in order of preference. The one at the bottom gets eliminated, and then so you end up with the person who's being elected being the choice of at least 50% of the actual people living in that in that electorate, as opposed to, as we've seen in American and UK elections, someone who's dearly loved by 20% of the people can prevail, even if 80% of the people are actually not on board.
That must lead to a greater acceptance of the government of the day and more political legitimacy. If I compare what you've just said to the UK example, as you've just suggested, your compulsory voting system means everybody participated, and your preference voting system means that only that person that was chosen by at least 50% of the electorate, either as a first or second vote, forms the government of the day. As you say, that's very different to what we have in the UK.
Yeah. No, and I think, as you say, Clive, the fact that these days you can't take for granted that sense of the legitimacy of government. There's obviously more challenge, I think, makes it more valuable. The other thing is, I think it feeds, and the institutions tend to lead into the values, and then the values kind of reinforce the institution. That it, because it is compulsory, elections are held on a Saturday. There's almost become a bit of a festival type of element. People talk about the democracy sausage. That there's a tradition of you take the family to the voting booth. You have a sausage sizzle, and I think that that's quite healthy for a democracy to have a sense that that this is part of what everyone does, in the same way as you enroll your children in school and you're up for jury duty and those sorts of things.
You just mentioned federation in 1901, which created modern Australia. That, of course, led to a written constitution.
Yeah.
We have seen in recent years that the lack of a written constitution in the United Kingdom can cause untold mayhem. We are today a country that's left the European Union without that being the settled will of a majority of the people in the country, merely because we never wrote down properly the rules, for example, in our country as to how a referendum would operate. Could you imagine ever any part of the UK adopting, I know you've made the point that you've lived in both countries for a long time, ever adopting the journey towards a written constitution and adopting some of these Australian reforms?
Yeah. So look, I think whatever you think of the result of the Brexit referendum, no one would claim that it was a triumph of smooth process and plain sailing. And I think if you had a clean sheet of paper, you would want to have clear rules about how that works. What happens in Australia is that you have to get a majority of everyone in the country plus a majority of the states, so the 6 states voting in favour. If it's not a perfect analogy, but if in a UK context, that might mean that you need a majority of Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and England, or London. You have a little more breadth of acceptance and buy-in. And I think what you have seen in practice is that where there have been referenda in Australia of the referendum that's happened, they actually tend not to get up. So you really need bipartisan support from both parties, in effect, as a precondition to get the sorts of numbers to actually have a change.
Compulsory voting, a written constitution, and preference votes, which therefore reflect the majority will for the government of the day.
Yeah.
All of those seem to me to be positives for example, a British adaptation or acceptance. Yeah. 2 things I've noticed on my trips down there that I don't find so attractive about the Australian institutional model. The first is the sheer number of levels of government you've got. Your states seem big, powerful, important, and therefore quite often seem to duplicate what the federal government does. Yeah. And the other thing that strikes me on every visit is that 3 years for the length of a government really isn't long enough to get anything done before they're running for re-election.
Yeah. So on the 3 years, I'd agree with you. I think 3 years is a relatively short time, and it does mean, in effect, because it's not even a 3-year fixed term. And so once you get to about 2 years, everyone starts to speculate about what's going to be the date, and effectively you're in election mode at that point already. I think the states is a bit more nuanced, Clive. So the way the federation worked was that the residual powers are still with the states, and then the Commonwealth has the powers which are specifically set out in the Constitution. And where the constructive, but also potentially sometimes destructive tension occurs, is that most of the revenue is accumulated by the Commonwealth, but the states spend most of the money. And as you say, what that's led to in a bad sense is that the Commonwealth then decides that they need a department to overview the departments in the state. That's the duplication piece. The positive that comes from it is that you don't have the same levelling up and regional inequality issues, because in practice, the dynamics of the federation and the fact that money is spent in individual states means, and also importantly, the upper house is elected and each of the states has an equal number of senators. And so what that means is effectively that there is a transfer from places like Sydney to places like Tasmania, South Australia, and so on. And so there's a again, this obviously shows in the statistics that there's not as much regional disparity as there is perhaps between London and other parts of the UK.
Yes, one of the strong points I noticed in your book was that the fact the states are still so important means that the country has a large number of capital cities.
Yep.
In the way that, of course, here in Britain, people for years have been bemoaning that we have one huge southeastern capital in London, don't seem capable of replicating anything with the same level of local geographical centrifugal force anywhere else in the country.
Yeah.
You, of course, have got a number of capital cities, and that does seem to provide more of a balance.
And it also means that decision making is often closer to what's happening. So if you're in Perth or a regional part of Western Australia, the decisions are being made largely around policing, around education, around nursing services and so on, are being made locally, as opposed to the UK, where there is a lot of centralisation and sometimes probably more micromanagement of particular issues around the country from Whitehall.
As you began to ponder on the Australian model, whether it be that regionalisation or the careful path that Australia has taken, or what you describe in your book as the sceptical pragmatism of the Australian psyche that was always tuning in to dealing with issues rather than making flowery oratorical speeches, all of those different issues, they seem to have led to a country which has got some pretty impressive statistics. Yeah. Take us through what particularly struck you about the success of Australia.
Yeah, no, well, so look, some of these things did surprise me because you don't miss. This is not Australians tend not to navel gaze a lot and to think about it. But if you look at something like life expectancy, Australians live on average 2 years longer than people in the UK. 5 years longer than people in the US. As you said, the GDP per capita is 30% higher, but even more strikingly, the median wealth level is twice what it is in the UK. And that reflects obviously the fact that there are less people sort of right at the top. So it's a relatively even or more even spread of people. You have 30 years without a recession up until COVID, and then and even now, Australia has a AAA credit rating. The US and the UK are double A's, half the national debt, and a number of surveys that have been done about healthcare, which is probably something that's worth talking a little bit more about. Put Australia among the top one or two in terms of both the efficacy and also the lack of regional disparities in terms of healthcare outcomes.
So the question is how much that success was organic and dealing with issues merely as they arose, or how much was part of intellectual or intelligent design. And one of the things I've noticed, again, I'm new to your country, Andrew, I went there for the first time in 2018, I've been there 12 times since, is a relatively strong streak of anti-intellectualism. And it's hard to imagine that a group of intellectual Australians sometime perhaps in the middle of this last century sat down and said, okay, we were the same as Britain in 1901, but we would like to very deliberately go on a path of divergence. And we think we've done the deep thinking of where we'd like to end up.
Yeah.
How did Australia get to this diverged position if it wasn't based on that kind of a group of political scientists or PPE graduates plotting out their future?
Yeah. So look, I think there are a combination of factors. Yeah. So the thing that was fortuitous was that in that early 20th century period, there clearly was a lot of influence of British thinkers and other thinkers on the people that were establishing the colony. But I think there was also an intent to differentiate. So Australia was not populated by the British elite. It was populated by generally a lot of people from the north, from more working class backgrounds, a lot of Irish. And then after the Second World War, big waves of first Greek and Italian migrants and other migrants. And so, I think perhaps a degree in PPE, not that there's anything wrong with that, is not all that's required to come up with practical solutions to problems.
Maybe the very precondition to become a British Prime Minister would rule you out from being a successful politician,
perhaps,
in Australia. You quoted Donald Horne just at the beginning. Indeed, you've kind of referenced him in the title of your book. And his book, of course, The Lucky Country, 1964, as you just said, did have quite a damning final statement that Australia was a first-rate country run by very second-rate people. Yeah. It is the lucky country.
Yeah.
When I meet Australians and ask them what they think about their own country, they don't come up with such a bullish presentation as you, particularly when they compare Australia with other countries. They seem to find themselves inferior. And yet you have just given us cold, solid facts that say that in many important respects, Australia is superior. Why can't Australians see that?
Yeah. So I think that was one of the reasons for writing the book, because I think there is a sense among Australians that while life is good, I think most people in Australia do think that they have it good. That as you say, that is either the passive result of some inheritance, some undeserved inheritance, or it's due to having a lot of resources or things like that. But if you actually look at the evidence on something like resources, the evidence and the work that's been done by economists actually suggests that paradoxically, counterintuitively, that having a lot of resources is usually bad it usually leads to lower incomes rather than greater incomes, because it tends to drive the exchange rate up. It makes other sectors more less competitive. And it also tends to result in the elites fighting among the spoils rather than making the investments that are needed. So, in fact, it's the Singapores of the world that don't have resources that are often the ones that perform the best. And actually, a lot of countries that have similar sort of resource endowments to Australia have not performed in the same way. The exception probably being Norway, where the institutions have stopped that kind of capture.
Famously, resource-rich countries also struggle with corruption.
Yeah.
And yet Australia has got a reputation for transparency and good regulation.
Yeah.
In fact, when you come to the global financial crisis, you are one of the countries that came through that without the severe knock or dent in the economy that, for example, the UK suffered. Yeah. Although your financial sector in Australia is pretty much as important to the size of Australia's economy as Britain's was at the time that the crash came in 2008. Yeah. How did you come through it without the ongoing, lingering pain that we are still struggling with here?
Yeah. Look, I think there were two factors with the GFC. One was that, as you say, although the financial sector in Australia is large, it was more domestic. So less kind of linked in a kind of contagion sense to other places, and tended to be regulated much more as a focus on mortgages and small business lending. Did less of the more exotic things that that came undone. But I think regulation was part of that as well. Australian banks were all very well capitalised, and there was a relatively proactive way that the government assisted to keep the capital markets open, but on a transparent basis, and actually charging where they lent guarantees to banks for their wholesale lending, actually charging market rates for that, which is obviously different, particularly to what we saw in the US, where there was a general public sense that the banks had taken all the upside and not the downside of their actions.
I have seen firsthand the impact inside Australia post the crash of examining how banks, insurance companies, asset managers, and other people very important to the savings and financial well-beings of Australians have come under the hammer for the way they've handled their relationship with Australian consumers.
Yeah.
I've also, through that, seen this concept of the Royal Commission, the idea that if there's anything that is causing public concern, the way a politician deals with that is they call for a big commission that will come out with blood-curdling recommendations, which, of course, the government of the day can then accept without any blame.
Yeah. Well, the UK has a bit of that, a bit of that as well. But yeah, no. Look, I think there is a bit of a paradox in the way Australians tend to think about government, which is that they are quite observant or have a lot of respect for government in the generic sense, but very little for the particular individuals that are in government.
Yeah.
And I think there's an argument that is actually the right way to think about government. Recognize that used appropriately, it can do good things, but be very skeptical about the motivations of the particular individuals and sweat the detail. And I think the fact that the elected upper house, for 37 of the last 40 years, the government has not had a majority in the upper house, means that every piece of legislation does need to be negotiated. You need to find a majority in order to get things through. And that does encourage a focus on the granular detail.
The phenomena you just described is well known, of course, here as well. Survey after survey shows that when people are asked what they think of the National Health Service, they think it's terrible. When you ask them what they think about their particular doctor, they think they're wonderful.
Yeah.
But of course, if everyone's thinking that, then surely the National Health Service must be a little bit better than terrible.
Yeah.
However, I have picked up a strong streak on every visit of a willingness to consider those in power as universally a shower.
Yeah.
And I find that translates also into a very robust press community. I mean, the headlines seem, at least as shrieking as those we have here in Britain.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I must admit, I started with writing this, Clive, thinking that that tendency of Australians to be very critical and really argue a lot about very micro things was a negative. But I think I've come to the view that it actually may be one of the strengths of the country, that it's very hard for people to go majorly off piste when everything is so critically assessed.
So when we leave institutions behind in this conversation, we also talk a little bit about the Australian psyche. And now we might move on to some policy areas. But just to summarise what we've talked about already today, you've got some strong institutional framework. You've got governments that enjoy legitimacy. They're working within the framework of a written constitution. You can kick them out after 3 years if you really don't think they're doing very well. And you've got the pressure reliever of being able to attack them every day in the press or any other way you want to, just because, as you say, there's a good, robust public dialogue.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, that sounds loud, noisy, but actually pretty effective. Yeah. The country feels like it's working great. That's really good to hear. The psyche you just mentioned has struck me in a different way. There's both this skeptical pragmatism that you refer to in your book that seems to say that Australians don't want to do big, grand projects. Of course, one of your greatest prime ministers, Paul Keating, said that if a politician is having a vision, he ought to see a doctor. And so there's a lot that comes through as you talk about the history of Australia that you seem, apart from, of course, one huge great project to dam the Snowy River, apart from that, it's been largely a series of small to medium-sized projects delivered as the country's developed. We, of course, in Britain plan big things the whole time, even if right to before the line lands in Euston, we end up cancelling them.
Yeah, well, I think my argument is that the strength of Australia, and to some extent this was Horne's argument as well, is in adaptability and flexibility and pragmatism, being able to do things. The history of big projects is actually not from defence procurements to broadband infrastructure and so on is that they tend not to work.
Good. Let's move on to some specific policy areas where, again, Australia does seem to be a little ahead of the UK. We'll start with health. You mentioned that 2 years extra life expectancy between the Australians and Brits.
Yep.
Talk to me about health and how it works in Australia.
Yeah. So there's actually probably three kind of major differences with the Australian health system that I think are interesting. The first is a greater mix of public and private provision. So about 50% of hospital beds in Australia are privately operated, and about 55% of people have private health insurance. Then the second thing is diagnostics. There's a much greater focus on diagnostics. So on a per capita basis, there are 5 times as many MRI and CT scanners in Australia as there are in the UK. And the third thing is more focus on primary health. So GPs are easier to see, and I'll come back to some of the reasons for that. And I think probably more effective in triaging people into different forms of care or sending them home if there's nothing wrong. Whereas the NHS has probably tended to be more hospital based. And there are some issues with that. And I think all of those three things are actually connected because the fact that you've got a lot of private money and private health insurance money going into the health sector means that while you do have universality of basic care, unlike somewhere like America, you also have the ability for doctors and nurses to earn a lot more, typically start on about 35% higher wages in the UK, and towards the end of their careers can have significant differences in the case of specialists or even GPs. But also the incentives are a bit different. So a GP in Australia is paid based on 15-minute increments of seeing a patient. A GP in the UK is paid based on the number of registered patients, whether or not they actually see anybody.
Sure.
And about 55 indicators that are assessed by a large bureaucracy. And so I think there are sort of subtleties like that which don't involve radically changing the things that people in the UK love about the NHS and are rightly proud of, but can be tweaked and evolved in a way that actually allows better outcomes for the same sort of resource investment.
The whole concept of how to deliver better policy outcomes in the last 20 years around the Western world and across liberal democracies has benefited from the arrival of nudge theory, the idea that you do things that will get people to quietly do the right thing without making it compulsory. We've had a nudge unit here in Britain for the last 15 years or so, seeking to bring around policy ideas. I employ around 1,000 people in Australia, and one of the things I noted amongst the policy, amongst the benefits that we provide those people, is that, back to nudge theory, not only is there a tax incentive to buy that private medical insurance and therefore don't become a burden on the state provision, but in fact, by the time you get to around $300,000 Australian of earnings, there begins to be a tax disincentive if you haven't bought it. And so there seems, that's strong nudge. There's both a stick and a carrot.
There's a real carrot and stick element to that. Yeah, no, and I think that is important. And then I think what that then also allows you to do is to have a sufficient critical mass to make it work. In the UK, less than 10% of people have private health insurance, and the market's just not big enough for it to work effectively.
Yeah.
And because you don't have private hospitals that say, well, you can have your baby in a public hospital and we'll pay for everything.
Yeah.
But if you want to choose your own obstetrician, have a fancier room, and all the rest of it, then you can pay this other specialist, and you can do it in private hospital. That allows more, and that's paid for by your private insurance. Then that becomes a self perpetuating cycle.
So I'm back again to the thing that I note and admire the most, which is it isn't just organic. Yeah. It also shows some very deliberate policy direction and leading. Yeah. You have now, as you've just suggested, 50% of your hospital beds owned by private insurers and provided to private policyholders. You couldn't get to that number by just hoping people would go out and buy the stuff. You've made it very clear that it's a government preference. You've put it into the tax system. Yeah. We don't seem to be that clear and directional in the way we act here in the UK. And I've noticed you did the same with your pensions, which is the second area where I know policymakers across the green here in the Treasury and elsewhere are studying Australia as a potential source of inspiration. Again, you acted very decisively, didn't you, in the 80s to reform your pension system?
Yeah. No. I think that, and that was one of many reforms that occurred in the 1980s, was the starting up of the compulsory pension fund superannuation system, starting with just a couple of percent. So initially, it was a trade-off for having lower wage rises, but you'll get this money that's in a pot that's going to be there for retirement. And then over the course of 40 years, it's been increased to the point that it's now about 12%. Well, it's now 12% of people's salaries are paid into these accounts. But there are some other important things about the way that works, Clive, and I think why the design has been broadly successful. One is that the pensions are defined contribution funds. So rather than being paid an amount based on your last salary by the company, you actually have a pot, and everyone gets a statement every year that says this is what you've got. You can choose your provider, so there's portability in terms of your pension. And what that does is it actually creates a pressure from employees, just from ordinary people, to say, I actually want this to be invested in growth assets. I want it to be invested in private equity. I want it to be invested in infrastructure and so on. And in practice, you do get a lot of that money going into those things, including now into lots of infrastructure in the UK as well. So whereas you oppose that, you compare that to the more fragmented and often defined benefit schemes that we have in the UK, which just don't have enough critical mass, where people are worried more about, are we going to have enough to meet our obligations next week? And so as a result, you only get about 4% of pension money in the UK being invested in domestic equities. Obviously, a very sore point with very much so. with the Chancellor and others at the moment. Something they're trying to change. In Australia, it's about 40% of the investment in the domestic stock market comes from pension funds and superannuation funds.
Time after time, we see that the clarity of a signal given by a government and the durability of that policy direction are the key to success. We just talked about health insurance now being so successful privately in Australia that half the hospital beds are owned and operated privately. You've just mentioned pensions, which are now making very large, substantial infrastructure investments because they've got absolute certainty the government's not going to change the pensions arrangements, and they know they've got guaranteed supply of new premiums and contributions coming in for decades. So it is worth spending that money building a toll road or building an airport or building something that the country needs, because they can rely on the availability of that capital. It is the durability of those decision-making, rather than the fact that the next government turns up and rips up what the last government did. Does that seem to you to be distinctive between the UK and Australia?
Yeah, look, I don't know. I mean, Australian governments are prone to making changes, and not all of them are good. But it is true that the basic um, uh, important foundations of the superannuation system persist. Sometimes people tweak,
Contribution rate.
the contribution
sure.
rate, the taxes that you get on the way in or the way out, and so
Yeah.
on. But broadly, as you say, there has been a strength there. And of course, once you build up, as Australia has a $3.9 trillion pot of superannuation money, you've got a lot of vested interests that are pretty keen to make sure that persists.
Okay. So two very big policy areas that we're all aware from public commentary that the current government is studying Australia to learn from.
Yeah.
One is health and one is pensions. Just the third area, I'd just like to get your view on as to whether there's any applicability, although it may be more controversial and contested. And that's the question of immigration.
Yeah.
From time to time, Britain talks about applying an approach to immigration similar to Australia's.
Yeah.
At the same time, when I'm in Australia, I notice that the question of whether Australia should be a big country, letting in another 10 or even 20 million people over the next 50 years, or should actually be maintaining its current size, seems very hotly contested. Yeah. Talk to me about immigration. Maybe there's some things the UK can learn.
Yeah, so I think that there are a couple of things that are worth mentioning there. One is that Australia is a comparatively high immigration country, even compared to places like the US that think they're high immigration countries. A quarter of Australians were born overseas. A half of Australians were either born overseas or have at least one parent that was born overseas. So that's a very large number, and across the OECD, significantly higher as a proportion to anywhere else. Despite that, as you say, there has been relatively strong social cohesion. And the surveys consistently show Australians actually being very positive about immigration, but by and large, and I'll come back to one caveat on that. And I think part of the reason for that is that the program has been very consciously designed. Again, to your point, firstly, in the 1970s, Australia was the first, together with Canada, to introduce the notion of a point system. And so the vast majority of immigrants are come in under a skilled migration program that is designed to favour people that have particular skills, that are English speaking, or at least have the ability to be effective in a working place. So I think that's one thing that has helped to keep a social consensus around high rates of immigration. The second thing, which is, as you say, more controversial, but certainly very topical in a lot of parts of the world, is a very strict approach towards illegal immigration. And from the 1990s on, there have been very strong draconian measures to process refugee claims outside of the country, in Papua New Guinea and Nauru, even on a couple of occasions sort of turning back boats. Now, those are the sorts of things that at the time were controversial in Australia. They're now relatively bipartisan. I think they're things that probably 5 years ago, people in Europe and the US would have said kind of a step too far, but are clearly now very much part of the conversation in Europe, in the UK, and in other places.
27 million people in an enormous continent. How big should Australia be?
Well, that relatively high rate of immigration has meant that the relative importance of Australia in a geopolitical sense has grown. So I think when Horn was writing, I think Australia was about a fifth the size of the UK. It's now about half the size of the UK. There's certainly scope for more immigration. The caveat, and this is certainly the caveat on the positive views about immigration, is that Australia, like the UK and many other places, is not building houses fast enough, and the price of housing is going up, and so that has led to, in effect, a cap on the number of people that people are prepared to to bring in a given year. So you had last year the immigration was creeping up towards about 2 people coming in for every 100 people in the country. A sustainable rate's probably one in 100. So maybe 270,000 new citizens on a population of 27 million.
And is this hotly contested? Are there people either in the political sphere or amongst the general population who would like to see a hard stop to this?
I think the proportion of the population that would like to see a hard stop is relatively small, but there is a general consensus of people that would say we can't get ahead of things too much, and so public opinion shifts, and I guess rationally, based on at particular times when housing affordability has the focus that it does at the moment, then there's a pressure on the government to pull the levers back a bit. I would hope that in other circumstances, and we've certainly seen it in the past, people are very comfortable to have a much greater introduction of people.
Donald Horne wrote The Lucky Country in the immediate aftermath of Robert Menzies, a hugely successful figure as your Prime Minister, but one who absolutely believed that Australia's role and destiny was as an English country or county, merely and strangely located off the coast of Asia. Yeah. As you look half a century later, what does Australia think it is now? Does it see itself as a slightly misplaced Western democracy, or does it see itself as an Asian country?
So I think what was interesting just after The Lucky Country was written, you saw the UK go into the EU, and that was a real shock for Australia, and caused a significant reorientation towards Asia. And now 30% of exports go to China. Japan's a big market. Korea's a big market. There's a degree of investment, probably arguably not as much as there should be in Southeast Asia. But I think the majority of Australians would still prefer not to have to make a binary choice. And so I think there's a recognition that there are geographical proximity is important for many things. But equally, in a world which is largely increasingly digital, which is services based, where a lot of the geopolitical issues are around norms, around cyber, around these sorts of things. Actually, you can have close partners and friends who don't have to be geographically proximate. And so I think as I suppose in the Boris Johnson words, the Australian view is when it comes to cake is in favour of the having and in favour of the eating.
Yeah. So we've just run through a pretty impressive list of great endowments that Australia brings into this century. Yeah. We've talked about its strength of its institutions. We've talked about it having tackled some of the more difficult policy areas that our country is still facing the need to address. We've talked about your proximity to strong and growing markets, a resources endowment, and the fact that you've had some of your big political internal battles, such as the one we just mentioned, such as immigration as well. As we then just bring this session to a close, you must have pondered as you ran through this book and put it together, what are the risks to this very, very successful Australian way?
Yeah. And I think there are two broad ones, Clive. One is the external environment. So we've clearly moved from a world which was very congenial to Australia, where there was a rules-based order, largely agreed after the Second World War and policed by the US. And Australians are great rule followers, and so they very much are very comfortable in that world where there are rules of the road and everyone follows those rules. Clearly, that post-war settlement has been eroding for a period of time, and with the second Trump administration is going to be even more challenged, and so that's a challenge for Australia to become more dexterous and more proactive in actually shaping its international environment and recognizing real power dynamics rather than just being a beneficiary of that order. Obviously with a particular issue with the superpower rivalry between the greatest customer. That's the first thing. Second thing is complacency. When you do have net median wealth twice the UK, 3 times the US, people feel pretty good about that and don't feel the need to make tough decisions, to be more productive, to do those sorts of things. And you've seen that whether you measure it on productivity or reform or different things, the 80s and 90s were a great period. You then had 20 years where things pretty much flatlined. And arguably in the last 5 years or so, in a number of cases, things have gone backwards. So the hope is that it doesn't take another crisis like the UK leaving to join the EU in order for Australia to start that reform process again.
Good. Andrew, your book is very lucid. It contains great observations and insights. Your affection for the country comes across right through the book, but also the careful detachment that I know, as you've described your own background as living in many different countries and having a career as an investor across them, that detachment comes across too. And so I found the book both a compelling way to understand Australia, but a fair and even-handed examination of what I can now see as a very successful Australian model. It left me with a single conclusion, and tonight you've confirmed it as you've run through the answers as to how these things got done in the way they got done, which is perhaps the greatest luck Australia has had is Australians. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Clive.